welcome to Adobe Lightroom Classic. I think it's important to get very familiar with this program because you're probably going to spend more time editing your photos than you will shooting your photos. Now, before we get started, I think there's an important thing that I'd like to talk about. I am currently in Adobe Lightroom Classic. You can see this is version 9.2. And it's important to note there are different versions of Adobe Lightroom. There is Classic, there is Creative Cloud, or CC as it's commonly referred to, and there is Mobile. But don't worry, it doesn't really matter what version of Lightroom you're using. All of the tools are fairly similarly organized. They're usually put in the same categories. For example, our toning, like our exposure and contrast, white balance, sharpening, tone curves, things like that are fairly similarly organized across all of the Lightroom apps. And even if you're using a slightly older or newer version of Lightroom than we're showing you here, you can still follow along. Lightroom really hasn't changed much other than a few little labels like shadows and highlights in the last 10 years. So don't worry if you're using a different version of Lightroom, you're still going to be able to follow along very easily. So let's get right into editing some of these photos we took at the winery. Now, I think Lewis covered organization very well. We talked a little bit about collections. Collections are one of my favorite tools in Lightroom, and Lightroom is awesome because not only can you edit your images, but you can do a great job of organizing your images as well. I love collections. They're like little file folders and filing cabinets, and inside those filing cabinets and folders, we have our little files or our images tucked away and organized very neatly. So whenever we want to refer back to a shoot, I can say Ashley that we photographed in Manitou, Ashley that we photographed in Denver. I can see all of my images here, and I can see my top selects in different collections here. So I absolutely love collections, and I highly recommend that you use them and keep your images organized for speed. Otherwise, you are just going to be looking at all photographs in this little bottom row here, and you are going to be seeing thousands and thousands of images potentially, and it's an absolute mess. So it's so much easier just to use collections, and now instead of looking at thousands of images, all these photographs, 22,000 photos for example, I only have to look at day 3 of photographing, and now I'm looking at about 60 images instead of 22,000. So you guys can see now where these collections really come in handy for speed and efficiency and peace of mind if nothing else. So we're going to be spending most of this lesson in our Develop tab right here. Lewis did a great job at covering our library, so now there's one thing I really want to talk about up here at the top of our Develop tab, and that is our histogram. Our histogram is like our mixing bowl for our image. It contains a graphical representation of all of the goodies that are in our image, our shadows, our blacks, highlights, midtones, whites, and you can see our RGB or CMYK colors here, and this is just a graphical representation of what your image contains. For example, this middle section right here labeled exposure is going to be our midtones, and the reason why it's actually labeled exposure is because you can click this on your histogram, drag left, drag right, and you can see your exposure value here, your slider is changing, and the exposure in your image is changing. So if you would like to work within your histogram and drag your highlights, your midtones, your shadows, left, right, add to the exposure, take away from the exposure, brighten and darken your image, you can do that right here in your histogram. It becomes a little bit difficult, but just know that if that is the way that your brain works, instead of wiggling these sliders, and you need to see exactly what part of your image you're affecting, and you want to be a little more hands-on, this is a great way to do that. Now, if you look in the upper right and the upper left of your histogram, you'll see these little arrows. You can see show shadow clipping and show highlight clipping right here. So when I hover over these little arrows, you can see that little red blob is popping up over here in our image. And if I highlight over this one, you can see there's a little blue blob that is popping up right there in Ashley's hair. You can see it a little bit better right there. Now, clipping is basically a fancy way of saying you are losing data. That data is gone. So if our shadows are clipping, you can see those very dark images that the blue is highlighting right there. If our shadows are clipping, that means the detail is lost. So if I export this as a JPEG right now, the detail in those shadows will forever be lost. And vice versa, you can see up here in this corner, if I export this, all the detail, which there really isn't any, up here in these highlights will be lost. So you can see, for example, if we would have taken this image a couple stops underexposed, you can see over here we are starting to lose things out of our histogram. And again, if we refer to our histogram as our giant mixing bowl, anything that goes flying out of the edges of this mixing bowl is on the floor and lost forever. You don't want to eat things off the floor. So if we clip on the left-hand side here and our shadows are very dark, we can see that we've lost a lot of detail now in Ashley's hair from being underexposed. And again, vice versa, if you can watch our histogram up here as I move our exposure up, we are going to start losing a lot of details here in our highlights. This is if we took our image way overexposed, like a nuclear blast. Our image just kind of got fried. You can see all of the areas where we would export this image and those are lost forever. Luckily, we are using RAW and a lot of these details are going to be maintained in our image, but you can absolutely still overexpose or underexpose a raw image. Just know if you are working on a very bright monitor or a very dark monitor, you can always double check your image because all monitors are different. Don't necessarily rely on your computer monitor. You can see where this can be an important tool between multiple devices. For example, if you're editing on your phone and your screen is very dark or very bright, you can see what your image actually graphically looks like. You can see where you're losing highlights or losing shadows before you export your image and as you're working. So if I want to add some blacks to my image and really crush those deep black shadows, I can do that. If I were to play with some other settings, like lower the contrast, really crank the contrast, that will affect our clipping potentially. So that is one quick tool I like to use, the histogram. It's very important to use this histogram. You will notice you also have a histogram on the back of your camera, and there's a reason for that, is to look at your exposure, see it in a graphical form. And again, all LCD viewfinders on the back of your camera are all different. The brightness fluctuates, usually depending on the environment you're in, if you have an automatically adjusting viewfinder, but it's never a good idea to rely just on your viewfinder. Always check your histogram, both on your camera while you're shooting and on your computer monitor as well while you're editing. So let's move on to profiles. That's another important part of editing in Adobe Lightroom. So what exactly is a profile? Let's figure that out. Typically, when you open an image in Adobe Lightroom, you will see the default profile is Adobe Color. And watch when I play with these profiles, you can see our histogram is ever so slightly affected and it changes slightly. You can see that. So let's go through some of these profiles. Think of a profile as an overall treatment, and I love this word treatment here, that Adobe Lightroom does to your image. And you will figure out that as you use Lightroom, you will find favorite treatments or profiles that you like to use. There are many built-in profiles, and if you want to, this is getting pretty advanced, but you can actually build your own profiles. But let's take a look at the typical standard Adobe profiles that we are given to work with. So our first profile is Adobe Color. It's the most basic profile that really comes with Adobe. It's usually the default one. You can see it's fairly standard, nothing fancy going on. You can leave this at Adobe Color if you want to. That is absolutely a-okay. If you want to take a look at Adobe Landscape, we can see our image just got very saturated if you're looking for a very saturated landscape. If we go to Adobe Portrait, we can see our skin tones for portraits got very soft, and I love this for portraits. I usually use Adobe Portrait about 99% of the time for portraits. Just I love what it does to the skin tone. If we zoom into Ashley here, we can see, let's go back to landscape, very oversaturated, not great for portraits. And then look at those nice flat skin tones. And let's go on to Adobe Standard. You can see a very subtle difference in the greens, in the skin tones. Standard works well. It's very similar to Adobe Color. It's a little bit flatter than Adobe Color. You can see they're a little flatter, a little less saturated. And then let's check out Adobe Vivid. I really don't recommend this one for portraits unless you're going for a very grungy or contrasty look. You can see it adds a lot of saturation. Let's go back to portrait. Adds a lot of saturation and adds a lot of contrast, and does not really look all that amazing on a portrait or human skin tone. So we'll go back to portrait and we will start editing from here. Let's take a look at our toning very quickly. Again, Lewis really went over this very well, so I'm not going to go too in depth. A lot of your toning is going to be case by case basis. It really depends what your image looks like, what your environment looks like. Do you have little bits of bright highlights that are distracting from your model, where maybe you want to bring down your highlights? Maybe I let the arm get a little bit overexposed. I can bring down my highlights here. I like what that's doing to the background as well. Again, we are taking our eye off of the background and going towards Ashley when we bring those highlights down just a touch. And our shadows will do the exact opposite. Now, usually when individuals have dark hair, even on a sunny day, I usually bump those shadows up just a touch, just to get a little detail back in the shadows. You can see that right there. And I'm getting a little detail back in the eyes. And if you'd like to add more detail, you can see Lewis's tip on adding a little radial filter to the eyes to make them pop just a touch. And our whites and our blacks are going to be the extreme end of our histogram up here. You'll see that they will adjust the very brightest and the very darkest parts of our image. So I've kind of dialed this in where I like it. I think that looks good. This image is looking a little flat. Now on contrast, I typically add maybe 10 to 20. I'll never go above 25 typically, just to add a little contrast to the scene. You don't want to crunch people's skin tones. You don't want very dark parts of the skin, very bright parts of the skin contrasting and not looking flattering. So I'll typically leave that alone. My exposure is a little bit hot. You can see we do have a clipped area. Clipping happens. You do have overexposed parts of your image sometimes, especially shooting natural light on a sunny day. And I might turn down our exposure just a hint, about a quarter stop right there. And that looks so much better. Now let's move on to this little presence tab we have here. And this is something you're gonna have to be very, very careful with. Now let's start with texture. Now here's a little portrait tip that I use. I will zoom into 100% or 1:1 here on our image. And let's reset this slider. And now we can see instantly a bunch of pores and textures came back in our model's skin. So watch as I slowly turn the slider down, all that texture disappears. But our image is not getting necessarily softer. I can still see Ashley's hair is very sharp. The details in the dress are very sharp. The necklace is sharp. The eyelashes and eyebrows and everything is sharp in this image. It's just going after the pores here. So it's almost like retouching very quickly in Adobe Lightroom. This is a great little trick for quick retouching in Lightroom. Now, I don't want to take the slider and drag it the other way. That looks very terrible, adds a whole bunch of grain, emphasizes if you're using a high ISO, and adds a bunch of texture that doesn't necessarily look great. So I accidentally hit this clarity slider. Let's reset that again by double clicking it. And clarity is one that you're really not going to want to mess with in portraits. I'll show you what it does, and you can see what it does in your images. It creates unnecessarily harsh highlights and shadows and contrast. Not great. This would be great if we were filming a zombie apocalypse movie, but we're not. And then if I turn it all the way down, you can see it creates a very terrible, unrealistic, it looks like a horrible Instagram softening filter, and it's bad. Never use that for making your image soft or as a replacement for retouching your model's skin. So for clarity, I typically leave that at 0. If I really want to mess with it, I really don't like to take it above or below 10 on either side, but 0 is great. Dehaze is another one that is similar to clarity. It works great with landscape, not necessarily for portraits. We can see here if I turn down the dehaze, it adds haze. If I turn it up, it subtracts haze, but we don't have any haze in our image, so I really don't need that one way or the other. Let's move on now to vibrance and saturation. So what is the difference between vibrance and saturation? They look like very similar tools on the surface. So let's take a look. Let's reset both of these, double click. There we go. And let's take a look at what happens when we turn our vibrance all the way down. Okay, it's almost black and white. There's a little bit of color still in our image. And when we turn our vibrance all the way up, not great, not loving it. Let's reset that. Let's see what saturation does. If we turn that all the way down, now we have an absolutely pure black and white image, absolutely no color. And let's turn this all the way up. And that is a toasted image. This image is deep fried. I would never want to publish an image like this. That's terrible. So we can see though, there was a big difference between saturation at 100% here, reset that, and vibrance at 100%. Neither one look great, but there is a big difference. Again, even at 0 vibrance, there's a difference between that and 0 saturation. So let's take a second to talk about these. So vibrance is more of a smart tool than saturation. Take a look at our histogram up here. When I turn up our vibrance, we can see none of our colors are clipping or getting lost out of our mixing bowl here. When I turn up saturation, look at that, we are clipping our blues. They're absolutely gone. And we have some clipped highlights right there. That looks terrible, absolutely horrible. But again, no clipping in vibrance, and there's a reason for that. Vibrance is made specifically for skin tones and to specifically not clip skin tones, which are going to be our oranges and reds and yellows typically. So I like to play with vibrance over saturation, again 99% of the time, because I know I'm not going to be clipping our highlights. Again, I would not push an image that far, but I would typically use a little bit. 15 looks good, just to add a touch of saturation to the skin and a touch of color to the dress, the trees, everything. And saturation I will typically leave alone unless I'm making an image black and white, for an example. I want a quick preview. Another quick preview to see what your image would look like in black and white. Hit the letter V on the keyboard, and you can see our vibrance and our saturation are grayed out here because in a black and white image, I cannot adjust my vibrance and saturation, obviously, because there is none. So we will hit V on the keyboard again, bring back our color, and that was just a shortcut to use this Adobe monochrome profile. We kind of skipped over that one here, so that's a great place to come back. When you hit V and you go to black and white, you can see this other tab over here comes up, color, black and white. So there are 3 ways to make your image black and white: this treatment, your profile, and dropping your saturation. So I think that pretty much covers our toning and development tab, our basic tools for getting our image tweaked, about 90% of where we want them to be. Another quick shortcut on your keyboard is backslash. We can see what our image looked like before. This is our before and our after. So you can toggle using backslash to see how far your image has come. And every now and then I like to hit backslash just to make sure I'm not over editing my image, because if you're staring at a monitor for a long time, sipping your coffee, doing a lot of editing for hours at a time, typically you can tend to over edit your images. I am very guilty of this. And one way of making sure that you're not taking your images too far, just hit that backslash and make sure your images are not looking unnatural compared to your original RAW. So let's take a look at a couple more of these tabs. We can hit this little arrow key, turn our basic tab, close that up, look at our tone curve. Now again, your tone curve, you're going to see just a slightly squared version, slightly skewed version of your histogram, where you can click and drag to edit your histogram. Now this is in addition to your basic tab here. Let's say you have your highlights cranked all the way one way or another. It's just not taking your image where you want it to be. This is where you can add a little more icing on that cake and add a little more contrast if you want to. Again, this is looking a little crazy, but just showing you your options of what is possible. Double click to get rid of these points. A nice flat tone curve is usually where I leave it. If I do add a little bit of a tone curve, it's just a very, very subtle S curve. That does not look too shabby. Another tool we can use in our tone curve is this targeted adjustment tool. So I can click, select our little targeted adjustment tool, and I can select a tone in our image and drag up and down to edit that specific tone. So pay attention to our histogram over here. As I click and drag up, it brightens those specific highlight tones in the wall. Click and drag down, it darkens. Again, you can take these tools too far, but everything is about subtlety and making small edits. If you're doing a good job at editing, no one should know you even edited this photo. We can click and drag down on our shadows or drag up on our shadows. Again, just an option. You don't have to use this tool. We can click and drag, or double click to get rid of that. And that looks pretty great. We can also hit this little button down here and manually edit highlights, our lights, our darks, our shadows. Again, just extra options if you would like. I'm going to go back to a linear curve, reset that, double click to reset these sliders here, hide all of this, put it away. I can also edit my reds in the image. I can edit my greens, my blues, my RGB. So again, I'm going to go back to linear, reset everything, and close our tone curve. Now for this particular image, I'm not going to mess with our HSL sliders. This would be great if you had some sort of hue in here that was very distracting. For example, if I thought this green was distracting, open our HSL, saturation. Again, our targeted adjustment tool here works just like curves. Click, drag down to desaturate. Now that doesn't look amazing. Again, I've taken this a little bit too far, but if I were to select a certain color and want to get rid of it, that is how I would do that. Again, that does not look amazing, but for example, if I had a bright pink or a bright purple traffic cone in the background, I can easily get rid of that. And to reset, double click saturation, but we're going to close that tab for now. Another tool we're really not going to be using in this lesson is split toning. We can just make adjustments to, let's say, our highlights if we want to make our highlights a little warmer, a little too warm, or if we want to make our shadows a little cooler. Just add some different hues in our image, just a different way of processing. Let's reset those back to 0. Now here's another little tip. You can see this is our arrow to open and close. We have this other little box thing. It's like a little light switch over here. Let's say I would turn my highlights all the way red like that, and I'm not sure if I like that. I'm not sure if I don't like it. I can hit this little light switch and turn the effect completely off. You can see the box is completely grayed out now, and I can turn it on. So I can play around. Maybe I want to come back to that later. I can close that up. I can turn it on, turn it off. Just more options and great little things that Lightroom does. Maybe I want to turn it on and reset it and close it back up. So that is great. Let's move on to sharpening. I add sharpening to all of my images. Every single photograph I take, every digital image needs a little sharpening. That's kind of my little motto. I added quite a bit of sharpening here. I went in and added a little bit of detail, which is your very, very fine, like sub-pixel sharpening. This image was taken during the day, so I really don't need any noise reduction. I don't really need much color noise reduction either. I can turn that down just a touch and you'll see our image gets ever so slightly sharper. If this is cranked all the way to the max, you can see that our image gets a little soft. So reset that. usually at a default of 25 for your color, but if you don't have a ton of noise going on in your image, you didn't use a high ISO, we can see here up in our histogram we use an ISO of 200, which is very low. That's very good. You can see we don't have much, if any, noise. I'm not seeing any visible noise in our image. So again, you can see we don't really need any noise reduction in this image, but if you did take an image with a high ISO, for example at night, absolutely use just a bit of noise reduction. Don't go overkill, but use enough to make your image usable. So we've talked a little bit about having sharp eyes in your portrait. Now you can see this funny little tool, looks like crosshairs. And click that and drag it over to our eye. Now that we can see our eye here, completely at 100% zoomed in, 1:1 ratio, our image doesn't have to be all the way zoomed in, but we can start messing with our sharpening and we see a very quick preview to make sure that our eye is sharp, and that looks pretty good. Again, when your eye is sharp, your image is in focus. That's kind of a rule to live and die by in portrait photography. Always, always, always have sharp eyes, unless you're going for some absolutely creative, artistic reason where you don't want your eyes to be sharp, but 99.99% of the time, you want your eyes to be tack sharp. So that is good for sharpening. Close that tab. Another tab we want to take a look at is lens corrections. Let's open that up. And you can see everything is grayed out. We have our automatic options here. And automatically remove fringing and chromatic aberration. There wasn't much of that in this image, just a very tiny bit. You can see here, it's not really affecting it that much. And then there's automatic profile corrections. And you can see what we did here when we turn that on and off. You can see we had some vignette, and that profile correction corrected that for my 50mm 1.4 lens. And you can see a little bit of distortion, and Lewis mentioned this already, but I'll touch on it again. Your lens is a circle and your sensor is a square. So we're kind of dealing with a square peg and a round hole situation, so your image will always be very slightly distorted. When there's nothing to really compare it to, our eye is really not going to notice much of that distortion until we start messing with those profile corrections. And I actually like that. It gives our image a very bright, kind of cheery vibe. We can again turn all of this on here, turn all of that on with our light switch. And let's say your automatic profile corrections aren't working. Sometimes you can go through here, select your lens, select the model of your lens, and then select, sometimes lenses have multiple profiles. That's just in case you are not getting, the automatic selection. You might have to go through here and manually select your lens profile. Sometimes newer lenses aren't necessarily updated in Adobe Lightroom yet, so you'll have to go through and manually fix your distortion, your fringing, and your vignetting. So you can override that and manually play with your vignette and again, your distortion. Yes, it does get crazy for your wide angle lenses. You'll notice a lot more distortion on super wide angle lenses. For example, we took a couple photographs on a 14mm lens. Let's find those here. Here we are. So you can see there is some areas of the image that may or may not be stretched out. Let's see, let's turn off our profile correction. Look at all of that vignetting and that distortion around the edge of the lens. And you can see these walls are starting to bow in a little bit, get a little bit distorted. And our profile corrections fixes all of that. Again, this was with our 14mm Nikon lens. So that's a great example of where you would use your profile corrections, and you can always see, turn that light switch on and off, what that looks like. Maybe you don't like the profile corrections. Maybe you like that nice vignette that kind of leads your eye towards the subject. That is all subjective. That is all up to you. I just want to give you all of the tools that you need to make the image that you want to make. So let's go back to one of the other images that we were editing right here. That looks good. So one of the last tabs I'd like to talk about here is the transform tab. Now this tab gets a little bit interesting, and as always, it's all about subtlety. So for example, let's say this wall was a little bit leaning forward or backward because we decided to take a strange angle of our model, either looking up from below or looking down from above. For example, let's take this image here. We're shooting down below Ashley. Maybe we want to correct that a little bit. Maybe we don't like that these angles bow in towards the center of the image. We can transform our image and we can actually make it look like we were higher up or lower down. Again, you can see some of that stretching and distortion. It's all about subtlety. We can do the same thing to make our image look like we were farther to the left or farther to the right. Again, this doesn't work in every scenario. It's on a case-by-case basis. This typically works more in architecture, more than portrait photography, because you have to be extremely careful about the subtleties of the human face and trying not to distort the human face. But again, just a tool to make some very subtle edits. Maybe I wanted this line to be very subtly more parallel. We can shut that on and off, and I can make that minor effect without affecting our model's face. So we can close that tab. And one last tab before we leave here today. Let's take a look at vignetting. On our other image, we remove some of our vignetting, but maybe you want to add some vignetting to emphasize the center of your image and emphasize your model. We can take this, click and drag, and just add some subtle vignette. We can change the midpoint, how close to the edge our vignette starts and ends, move it in a little bit, how round or square we want our vignette, how much feather we want. So we can see all these tools a little bit better if we turn our feather all the way down. And I'll really kind of max these settings out to show you what our vignette is doing. So this is affecting our midpoint, our roundness of our vignette. So now you can kind of see what those are actually doing. It's difficult to see when your vignette is very feathered. I usually like my feather usually about 100%. You can turn this again down, just a touch of a vignette to get our eye to go towards the center of the image. And now we can light switch, turn it on and off. And again, just moves your eyes away from the edges and towards the center. Again, some people love vignettes. Some people spend their whole lives trying not to get vignettes and doing image correction. It is all up to you, and these are just tools to make your images better. So again, we can take a look at the before and the after, and the image that we started with, the before by hitting backslash, and after, just very minor edits. Because as Lewis said before, when you're taking a good image straight out of the camera, there's not much editing that you're going to have to do. And when you spend that extra couple seconds of time on set getting your crop and your composition exactly where you like it, getting your white balance correct on set, getting your exposure and everything like that on scene, taking a properly exposed image, you're going to realize your life is going to be a lot simpler in Photoshop and Lightroom. And again, same thing with getting a sharp image, making sure that your photograph is in focus, you're using a high enough shutter speed to capture your model, and you are using a deep enough depth of field to capture your model in focus. You're going to realize your life is going to be so much easier rather than trying to fight with Lightroom later on to fix your image or fix mistakes later. So again, you can see very subtle edits to our image. So that is a basic overview of how we corrected some of these images from the Winery. Again, you can see all of them. I like this one in black and white. A little side note, all of these look pretty good all by themselves, just very minor edits, a little bit of contrast, a little bit of vibrance, and playing with that color profile, but again, making our images look very natural. Not over editing is the key. Keeping our color palette very simple. Soft contrast on the skin, adding a little bit of sharpening. And again, very simple. This is very easy to do, and as you edit more, you'll start to realize you develop a style of what you like, what your eye likes, how your eye sees, and you will see a style develop over time. And again, get it right in camera, and this will be much easier for you. And that is really all for editing these photos at the winery. I will see you guys in the next lesson.